interesting way to think about trust from all of these various vantage points. And we've touched upon this a little bit, but I think that we should have just like a rapid, what would you say if I said trust to what end? Joy, do you want to start on this one? What would you say?
Survival.
Okay. Ashley.
Oh boy. I mean, I think it's so that communities and democracy can thrive.
I don't know what else to add. I would say.
Yeah, kind of hard to go last on that one.
Sorry.
Survival and really serving our role as journalists.
Yeah.
What about you, Talia?
Democracy.
And
I
democracy.
would say something similar. So now let's really get into the meat of it. We've kind of laid the groundwork here. What is trust? It's about relationship building. We've established that this is something long-term, not a 3-month rapid-fire newsroom effort. It's something that has to be done over time. But I think now we should really delve into what I think are practical tips for taking home from this. So what are examples of newsrooms that have successfully built trust, and how did they do it? What are the tips that we can offer? Joy, do you want to start?
Sure. So we often start with newsrooms by doing that listening and sort of a content analysis of your feedback loops. What are people complaining about, and what do they misunderstand? And so based on what you learn there, it could be that you're getting a lot of accusations about a bias and agenda that drives your work. So the answer is, are you explaining how you work to be fair and why you really are here and what you hope to accomplish? It might be that trust is lost because you're charging money and people don't think it's fair that journalism as a public service should charge money. So are you explaining your business model and why journalism costs money? It might be that people are complaining about inaccuracy or complaining about which types of stories you cover. So are you filling that information gap? Are you explaining to people how you decide what stories to cover? So the question of building trust and earning trust really begins for me with the question of what is getting in the way of trust. And then we just see time and again that when newsrooms invest in asking that question, that they can come up with things to do that really aren't all that complicated, that address for their particular audiences. But wait, you have that wrong. But wait, we're not, you think this is true about us. That's crazy. How could you think that's true about us? Well, perhaps because we're not actually correcting that record and giving you information, providing a counter narrative to whatever you think is wrong with the, journalist is the enemy of the people.
And Joy, can you share more? Like, how could a newsroom actually do this? So let's say I'm at a newsroom and I've never really thought about asking the audience this. What are strategies you've seen newsrooms employ in order to figure out what their audience is thinking and what misperceptions they might hold?
So for example, we see newsrooms where people leave comments on a story saying like, oh, you just did that. You didn't interview this person because they advertise with you. And so the fact that they advertise with you means you don't want to make them mad because you would lose an advertiser. Like they think that advertising dollars influence the news decisions, basically. So it's really easy to blow those off. And what we suggest is like, no, instead, you should explain how your funding works and that advertising dollars don't affect the news. If you're getting complaints about accuracy during breaking news, one of our newsroom partners started to put just an italicized note at the top of a breaking news story saying, this is a breaking news situation and we will point to the best information we have at the time, but as often happens, new information emerges and we'll move quickly to correct the record if we get that wrong. That is not a complicated thing to do. Articulating that and inserting it at the top of a breaking news story is not hard, and it also is not something that can be taken for granted. There are people who think we don't care about getting it right. So what we focus on is, oh, you're seeing complaints that you don't care about getting it right? Well, have you told people that you care deeply about getting it right and what your process is for checking the accuracy in fast-moving situations? Like, whatever it is, explain it.
That's really great, and I've heard of other newsrooms surveying their audiences or having kind of focus groups, and I think you've done some of these things as well as a way to try to surface what people are thinking about the newsroom, what concerns they might have, or what questions even they have about how news is produced, and using that as a way to generate ideas. So I think that's super exciting. Ashley?
I want to give all of the answers. I think, one of the things that I just most love to do is we invite community members over for lunch. We've tended to think about this, when is there something that we feel like we're maybe just not covering the way that we quite want to, or is there a segment of our community that we want to be engaging more? And it's not particularly formal. We call it feeding the conversation. It's invite only, but every invitation includes an invite to tell us who else we should be inviting. And we do small group conversations. We use something called appreciative inquiry. So we're really building on generative thinking, asking questions like, imagine mainstream media, imagine we're getting your story right. What does that look like? And inviting people to tell us what that would look like. And in doing so, identify themselves so that we're not projecting that onto them. We also do this where, I always chuckle when I tell this part. So we invite people to lunch, and every table is 4 or 5 people sitting down with one of our journalists, and they're typically excited because this newsroom, whether they listen to us or not, has invited them over because we care about what they think, and then our reporters and journalists are excited because I've brought food, and and we get to have stories we might not otherwise, and people are let into the process. It's also for those of you who have been in engagement or sourcing roles, it's so much more effective than jumping up and down and telling a reporter you've got this really great source. If they get to have that moment of discovery for themselves, they do quite a bit. And we've been investing in human-centered design also, so thinking about how can we sit and have interviews with people one-on-one or one-on-two to get a better sense of what they need, so that we're building our product and around them. And so one of the things that's been kind of fundamental to building trust is really understanding that while we often think about journalism and we think about like this package of what we're delivering, our audiences or aspirational audiences are thinking about information. And so how do we shift some of our own thinking so that we're meeting needs and we're meeting people where they are? I know it's a bit of a cliche, but for us that's meant saying, okay, well, we're going to do reporting or storytelling the way our traditional audiences are interested in, but we're also going to do postcards, or we're also going and use direct mail and data that we have to get to people that way, or use SMS. And then I think what's most critical is we're not leaving. And so it's, you can be in a newsroom that says that we have this initiative or that initiative, and we're going to go after this audience for that, and you spend all this time doing it, whether you're talking about student veterans or young parents or what have you. But if you spend all that time and then you leave, you've probably eroded more trust than you've gained.
That's great. Sally?
Yeah, so when I love what Joy and Ashley are saying, and these are really important on-the-ground practices that newsrooms are doing. What the Trust Project does is add some structure and communication around that. So when I think about, I've done a lot of work on improving diversity and inclusion in the newsroom and in our stories. And one of the key things that we found in that work is you really have to have 2 things. One is commitment from the top, and 2 is structural and institutional commitment, if you will. And so what the Trust Project does is all of our, and I love the user-centered design approach. That's what we use to really understand what people were looking for in the news. What do they value? When do they trust it? When don't they? And then we married that with journalistic values to come up with these 8 trust indicators that news sites show on their pages and also in their markup so machines can read it. And just quickly, they show the who, what, and how is behind the news. So what are your standards? Information about the journalist. Labeling, news, analysis, opinion, paid content, showing your work. What are your methods? What are your sources? Not on everything, but on one stories that might be more controversial, or your investigative stories. Is there a local expertise there? Demographic expertise? Diverse voices? How committed are you to including all of the communities that you cover, all of the communities in the area, the region that you serve, even more broadly? And then public engagement. So what's happening, what we find is you make this commitment, you make it public, and number one, it's really good for the news organizations because people can see, yes, this is how journalism is different. And then 2, frankly, it does make you accountable as an organization to follow up. And then thirdly, what happens, I think, is it really helps because there is this consistency across the world, really. We have organizations in Latin America, in Europe, in Canada, in the US doing this. And so they have an opportunity to have conversations about, well, when do you really use corrections? What is the bar? Where do you put it, at the top or the bottom or somewhere else? So all of these pieces, I think, work together to help build trust.
One thing I forgot to say that I think is something that every newsroom can and probably should steal is this year we rolled out public-facing mission statements for all of our reporters. And so what we were able to do is to work with the reporters. I mean, and for some, it was like a year-long process. It's not something that we decided in the morning we were going to do and we threw out on the website, but to really bring clarity to what their focus is. So even as we have Adolfo Guzman Lopez, who's a higher education reporter, but his real focus is on the first rungs of higher education and Californians who are going to community college. And so he puts that in there, and it's this statement that people who are coming in can better understand what he's really focused on. We built it so it's inside of a Harkin embed for anybody who's familiar with Harkin, which means there's also an invitation to ask questions directly to him through that, and it travels with him. What I also love, and to what Sally was saying, it brings a lot of clarity for the reporters too. So as they're pitching stories, the question is like, is this aligned with my mission statement? And if not, is it really newsworthy to the point that we should be reporting it? Our executive editor, Megan Garvey, is at ONA this year, so if anybody wants to ask her questions about it, I'd strongly encourage you to do so because she was really hands-on.
And I think it's just brilliant because we have this journalist information that we ask a page and then information on the article page that all newsrooms apply. It's such an intentional approach that you folks are taking, and I told Ashley before, I hope we can really take that and integrate that concept into what we're doing at the Trust Project so it spreads around the world.
The question of mission and motivation is really a key one, and it's something I think we don't talk about enough, both at an individual journalist level, like why are you here, why do you do this? And then also on a brand level, like if you just think about the intense messaging machine happening across the country right now about what journalism is here to do and what its purpose is, and how negative that messaging machine is about, the enemy of the people and here to divide people, and here we suppress certain agendas and highlight other agendas, and like this is what a lot of people actually think, and there are people we're never going to reach. There are people who believe that and are not persuadable. But I think a lot of people are persuadable. And the sad thing for me is how little counter narrative there is. Mm-hmm. So like a lot of us maybe have a mission statement. And if you haven't looked at yours in a while for your organization, I encourage you to think about it. Often they're pretty vague. And if you point to it, it doesn't actually help you make decisions day to day. So I really encourage you to think through how you do make decisions. Like we all have more of what we could cover than what we cover, right? So how do we narrow that down? What are we here to do? What are our goals? What do we stand for? If you're trying to highlight the diversity of voices across your community, do you say that? And when people push back and say, why do you keep writing all these stories? Say, well, actually, one of our sincere goals and obligations as a public service organization is to reflect this diversity. Do you have something you can point back to? And is that, first of all, is it agreed upon in your newsroom? And second of all, have you published it so that your staff can be empowered to quote from it, so that you can link back to it when people accuse you of things? I think that we're not telling our story, we're not explaining what we do and what value we offer our communities.
And in contributing to this space, what the Center for Media Engagement has been doing is collaborating with many of these wonderful ideas and projects and actually evaluating whether or not they do have the impact of increasing or affecting trust. Because you could have really amazing good intentions of doing something to increase trust, and that may not be the case. And if you're not doing some sort of an evaluation to determine what's working and what isn't, that can be really problematic. So for instance, we've collaborated with the Trust Project on some research examining whether including these trust indicators on articles actually does improve trust. And it does, in fact. So we now know that this has the impact that it was intended to have. We've also collaborated with Trusting News and folks from the USA Today and the Tennessean, looking if you include a box in your reporting somewhere that explains your process. What did you do to actually come up with this piece of journalism? And it's not that complicated of a thing to include, to just alert readers of what went into this particular article and this particular reporting. That including a simple box like that with your reporting also has the effect of increasing trust, even for established brands like a USA Today or a Tennessean. So I think that's a pretty impressive outcome. And we've also been investigating non-traditional forms of journalism. So we collaborated with the Center for Investigative Reporting and StoryWorks, and they've actually been doing reporting-based journalism and plays that people attend and then they're learning about whatever that piece of journalism. But this goes back to Ashley's point of meeting people where they are. And this also speaks to the Unheard LA initiative that I hope you'll mention and chat about a little bit, because this sort of technique works as well. It makes people evaluate news organizations more positively, and they're doing a different type of journalism, and they're being creative. And I think that it's really exciting to see evidence that all of these different sort of initiatives are affecting trust. But again, I'll say, in not every instance do we find that trust increases as a consequence of good intention. So figuring out what the objective is and then evaluating whether or not you actually did end up increasing trust, if that was the goal, I think is really paramount. And I know that there are a number of different academics in this room and organizations that work with newsrooms to try to help them do that good work. So please don't hesitate to reach out if those are questions that your newsroom is wrestling with. And I don't know, I kind of gave you a
Talk about Unheard. I am always happy to talk about Unheard LA. So Unheard LA is a live storytelling series that we produce at KPCC. It's completely community centered, and it started with a pretty simple goal. We wanted to be a catalyst for conversation and connection. So it was a big goal. But with the idea that we're doing some asset analysis. Like, we know what we have. We have a stage and a microphone and this team that can produce really great events, but we don't have the stories of Angelenos. And so it was an invitation to say, if you have 5 minutes, what's the story you would share that would reflect your community? And through that, we've been able the last 3 years to explore LA one story at a time. We don't do themes. We just have that invitation, and we, in particular, go to venues and areas that we haven't really spent a lot of time in as a public media organization. And the response that we've had has just been phenomenal. We have, in the first 2 seasons, more than 80% of the people who RSVP'd were doing so for the first time for any of our events, and we're an organization that's done something like 1,000 events. And they tend to be the youngest, most diverse audiences that we have across any of our live events.
Those sound like important metrics.
They are important metrics. One of my, to what Joy said too, you're constantly learning. We do in-person conversations with all of the participants after each season, so we can learn how to improve the experience for them. We also are, asking our audiences all the time, and one of my favorite bits of criticism that we got after our first season was this was really great, but there weren't any older white people. And as a public media organization, that's a critique we never get. So it was pretty exciting. And I will say that we did shift to make sure we had more age diversity, and with that age diversity, the stories that we get, because the thing is that if you think about who lives down your street or who's down the apartment, hallway, you don't know what they have. And so whether it's stories of surviving an internment camp in Indonesia during World War II, or I was sharing with the other panelists that last weekend we had a show where a participant basically read an annotated version of his gender reassignment surgery receipts. And people were crying, and I was crying, but I cry a lot. And so I walked back from backstage to the lobby just in time to hear an audience member walk up to Daniel, who was the person who shared, and he said, "I'm leaving here a different person than I came in." And so again, I started crying. But it was this moment to say, when we build these connections, when we invest in relationships, we're able to get trust in a different way. And I hear the stories and I see what so many of our reporters experience, and I have to say, I get hugged a lot. And I think, it helps me continue the work that we do, but it's also because we're leading with that relationship first, where it's not just letting community members or audience members start to add a face to the voice or to the byline, but to know that we see them too and we hear them too. It changes the dynamic, much like this lighting change, dramatically.
So exciting to hear about all of these ones. I want to take us in just a little bit of a different direction for a moment, which is we've been sharing a bit about building trust and examples of where it's been done well and techniques that you can use and bring back to your newsrooms. But I often find that you also learn from the negative, so instances in which trust was lost. And so I would like to invite the panelists to share an example of trust building that had good intentions and went awry, or perhaps a newsroom that lost trust, and what can be learned from these examples. And feel free to anonymize the newsroom if you so choose. Sally, do you want to get us started?
Yeah, well, so we work with all of these different kinds of newsrooms, and I would say the single most important thing that can go wrong is if you don't follow up on your promises. So once you make a commitment, then people are they're excited by that. And sometimes I'll get an email like, why did you invite so-and-so, or why is so-and-so part of the trust project, because they're not doing X, Y, Z. And so then part of being part of the trust project is you are responsive. Public engagement is one of the trust indicators. And so, and there's certain ways we encourage that. So then I'll just push it back to the newsroom, and the success story that comes out of that is if the newsroom does respond. I had one where it took a couple tries. Finally, because they said the member of the public wrote the email address that I had given them, there was no reply. They're like, these people aren't serious, they don't mean it. And so then I told the newsroom that, and then eventually they put this person in touch with the editor-in-chief of the newspaper, and of course that solved the problem. And I'm not saying that you should solve every problem by involving the editor-in-chief, but the idea is that you really, if you are serious about trust, you have to be committed to following up. No empty promises here.
I think that we've had, because I do a lot of in-person convenings, like we've had ones that have gone sideways a bit, and whether it's somebody who comes in wanting to agitate, or you have a facilitator that falls down a little bit in the role. But the thing, so in the engaged journalism space, one of the things that you hear a lot is to be relational, not transactional. And I think it's a really good sort of guiding statement. But the one sort of exception for me is thinking about how, we don't want to be transactional, but through all of these acts of engagement, all of the ways that we show up and continue to show up, we are building social capital. That is what carries us through the times that we fall down. So if we are, there may be some major exceptions to that, but for the most part, if people are able to say, I'm sticking around because of you, or I'm sticking around because even though this didn't work, I know that generally speaking, you're an organization that shows up for us, that can really help. And I'm actually thinking about one particular day that was really rough, and we had some things that we were trying to do and they didn't work. And there was a gentleman there he's a Republican strategist, and he's somebody that you wouldn't necessarily think of as a huge NPR fan. And he was sticking through this really hard day, and finally he said, Ashley, I really don't want to leave, but I have to go because I think I'm passing a kidney stone. And so he went from there to the hospital, but he was going to stick it through, up until the point that he's like, no, I need medical attention. And that's only because he had the trust in us as an organization.
Wow, great stories.
So I have kind of two ways I want to highlight that I think things can often go wrong. One is that they kind of both relate to not getting credit for our good intentions. And not getting credit for being thoughtful, ethically driven organizations. So one example is that we see a lot is when newsrooms take a lot of thought to make important decisions. Think about all the times that journalists are gathered around a computer debating word choice, debating whether to use a photo. We take our jobs pretty seriously in a lot of newsrooms. I hope you guys are lucky enough to be in places where that happens, and yet we don't pass that on. So, or maybe we write an editor's column that says, we thought about this a lot, and here is why this decision, we thought it was important for our community to do this. But then nobody sees that column, right? And the content just travels, and the public conversation happens, and we don't get credit for having that thoughtful decision. So a lot of what we do is around highlighting the ethical decisions and the processes that make our work more credible, and doing it in a way that people will actually find it accessible. Another way is just being clear about our goals, and especially around types of content. So one recent example, and this is not one of our newsroom partners, one recent example of really powerful journalism, I thought, was the recent editorial from the Baltimore Sun where they really took on President Trump. So that is an example of powerful, local, standing up for your community. There's an opportunity there to really build trust. No, you don't. We speak for Baltimore, and here's what you, federal government, needs to know about Baltimore. If you paid attention to how that editorial traveled around the interwebs, it said, the Baltimore Sun takes on Trump. And when you click through to the editor, which like there's an institutional voice that is speaking on behalf of the Baltimore Sun, but how many people who saw that had any idea just how separate that was from the reporters in the newsroom? And when you click through to the editorial, it's said at the top by the editorial board, but there wasn't an explanation of what that was. And you guys, people don't know. So I'm at the point where I think every piece of opinion content needs to have an explanation at the top of it, not just a click through, but like in italics at the top, this was written by an editorial board with like an annotation, a clause that says, which is completely separate and uninfluenced by what happens in the newsroom. And we are being negligent if we don't do that. And we actually could lose trust in an opportunity to say, we are standing up for our community, and this is why it's important for a local newspaper to stand up for its community. Instead, I think trust is lost because what you're doing is setting up an adversarial relationship in the way that message is spread.
I was just going to say a really good example of that is the Toronto Star, and because that's one of the things that we ask of news sites. And so they've gone above and beyond, and so they're not just labeling opinion, but they label editorial. You can see what an editorial is, how it's distinct from what happens in the newsroom, and then you can click through to just little short bios of everybody that's on that editorial board and how to contact them.
And my example of trust building, or of a situation where trust was lost and how it was handled, and I'm actually going to name names because they did a really good job of thinking through this. So in the 2016 election, the Dallas Morning News, for the first time since the Roosevelt administration, had endorsed a Democrat and endorsed Hillary Clinton. And of course, there was a very angry reaction to this in the community. And this, I have to say, as a testament to the editor, Mike Wilson, who I don't know if he's here, but if you see him, tell him we mentioned him. But I thought did a really smart thing in response to that, which is he invited some of those people that were very critical of that decision in to have a discussion with him. Like, let's talk about how you think this newsroom is covering various issues. Let's talk about how the newsroom came to this conclusion and what an editorial board is doing that might be different from the newsroom. And the result of that just frank conversation with just a few members of the community was, it amplified so much because here's an editor that took the time to listen to people that didn't agree. And I thought that was just such an amazing way to handle things. And, you know, they didn't come out of there in agreement singing Kumbaya or anything like that, but they came out of there with an appreciation of, here's an editor that actually took the time to talk with us about an instance in which we felt the trust had been lost. So I wanted to highlight that one. So I want to make sure that we have ample time for questions. So I'm saying this so you can all plan ahead what your questions are in just a moment. And as we transition to that point, I want to ask the panelists to reflect on two things rather quickly. And one is the downside and one is the upside. So the downside is, why is it so difficult to build trust? Like, why is this such a challenging thing that we need to keep having panels like this in order to think through it and take at least an hour of our time to wrestle with the ideas of trust? And then the upside, so downside, what is the challenge? The upside is, what does it feel like when we get this right? So we can leave you as we end and transition to questions with both of these. Okay, Joy.
So the reason it's so difficult, I think the primary reason it's so difficult, when we go around talking to newsrooms about this, there aren't a lot of people saying like, no, that's a terrible idea. Of course we shouldn't do that. It's time, right? It's like, how do you prioritize this? We're asking journalists who are creatures of habit to upend their routines, to ask new questions, to find more ways to talk directly to their audiences, and it is hard to wrap our brains around a new way of doing things. What it looks like when it gets it right, honestly, when we look at newsrooms like WCPO in Cincinnati is a great example, a TV station we've been working with for a few years, and they have this unbelievable culture of responsiveness, of anticipating what might our audience assume about why we did this story exposing something. What might people, when we're making this decision about our political coverage, oh, maybe we should go on air and explain that and then link back to that explanation every time we do this in the future so that people can see we're consistent because they don't believe we're consistent. So that when it's done really when it's really done right, I think what it looks like is good responsiveness and proactivity around warding off possible mistrust.
Sally, do you want to jump next?
Yeah, so I think part of what makes it hard is that we all feel that we are trustworthy as journalists, and we know, like, that's part of who we are as journalists. However, in order to earn trust, to re-earn it. Sometimes it means changing our practices. And just an example of that would be Folha de São Paulo, when they were confronted, where they were doing all the trust indicators, and they looked at the one that said diverse voices, and they said, oh, that doesn't apply to us, that's an American thing. And I'm like, really? I mean, we had heard this from users around the world that they wanted to hear from diverse voices in the news. And so I went back to them, we talked it over, and they're like, oh, okay, yeah, I guess we really do. It does matter in Brazil, and anybody who knows Brazil a little bit would know why. And then so this was a big change in just how they think about themselves. And then what they did is they decided to go in all the way. So not only did they come up with a statement, we're going to be committed to inclusive reporting, and here's why it makes a difference in our responsibility to you. And then they went and hired somebody, a person who was responsible to ensure there were diverse voices in their reporting. So that's, it's a change in our attitudes, and I think, I forget who started, Ashley, when you said it's really about also trusting the audience. So it's about changing our attitudes, trusting the audience, and then putting the pieces in place that will really ensure that we do this. And so sometimes it is a little bit of effort. Oh, and how does it feel? You feel confident and you have a real relationship with your public.
I think these are the questions that are hard to go last, but we're at a moment where we have communities struggling with media literacy and news organizations struggling with community literacy. And so we have to be thinking about, how are we reflective? What are the small ways that we're losing trust? It can be your word choice. It could be your style guide. It could be the fact that that folks are listening to NPR all day and don't realize that they're actually consuming news from 7 different organizations. So all of those things are at play. And then I think about when we get it right, it's when newsrooms are able to recognize this as this work as an engine for our future. And I think in particular about a project that we've done called Human Voter Guide, where we started in 2016 wanting to answer election questions and realized pretty early on that people didn't have questions about the candidates, they had questions about the mechanics of voting. And so we pivoted, and I very happily call it the Butterball tricky line for voting. But as people started to build trust in this service that was information first, then they started to come to us when things weren't looking right, and we were able to help break the story to the registrar that thousands of names had been left off a list because we were the first place people came because of trust, and because of trust, we did better journalism.
Okay, and as we open up to questions, I'm going to say here are 6 tips. If I were to summarize what we had in this panel, here are 6 things to take away. 1, understand why people don't trust. So whatever mechanism you use to do that, understand why that's happening in the first place. 2nd, invite the community. Invite them, whether it's to lunch or to your newsroom or something. 3, ask people what they need. A couple folks on the panel here mentioned that as a key takeaway. 4, be public-facing about it. Having the 4-hour conversation inside your newsroom and never letting the people who are consuming your journalism know about it is not going to work. 5, go where you haven't spent time. Go to those locations so that you get to know those people and they know you care. And then 6, assess whether it works. So you have some mechanism for evaluating whether you've done what you've hoped to do. And I hope that that reflects several of the comments that we've seen throughout this panel and gives you 6 key tips for going back to your newsrooms as you think about what we've talked about here today. And with that, let us open it up to your questions as we think about this issue. And we have one enthusiastic hand right off the bat. And a gentleman.
Well, I think in some cases it might be hurting more than it's helping. I think that most people aren't even at the point of putting the word opinion in the front of every headline so that it travels when it goes to social. So many news sites have a little kicker above the headline that's like the section head or something, or they use different words like column or editorial or letter, and you guys, people don't know what that means. They actually don't. And so, we're working with a series of newsrooms right now on like assessing the words they use to describe opinion content and trying to simplify it, and then like, attaching labels to each one. I don't know why we're not just shouting it from the rooftops and being overly clear. Like redundancy. You should not be able to pick up a piece of opinion content without something describing who wrote it, whether they're a staff member, whether they have anything to do with the newsroom, and where it came from, and why you do it. Do you have a statement about why this is important? We're not talking about it. We're frustrated that people don't understand the difference, and we can wish they understood the difference all we want, but they don't understand the difference, and we're not doing anything.
Well, let me tell you too, in our user-centered research, when we talked to people about what it was that they were concerned about and why didn't they trust it or did they trust the news, that was one of the top things. And they even said they weren't sure that journalists knew the difference between opinion and fact-based journalism. So we do have, all of our sites show labels explaining what is it, that this is opinion, this is analysis, this is news is assumed, and then paid content. And the thing that I think is interesting and worth thought for everybody in this room is it was a challenge for us to come up with definitions that we all could agree on. So if we have challenge trying to figure out, well, what is it we really mean by opinion, and how does that differ from news? Imagine the problems that the public will have with it. And I believe that it is critical that we do share the same definition, because if everybody has a slightly different definition for what opinion is, we're just confusing the issue. So I really feel that I agree that there are nuances, of course, that may go to, that your newsroom may want to add. But in general, let's get to these same definitions and offer some clarity around what are the lines here and why do they matter. And then the other thing, I just feel that punditry really is something we ought to think about. Journalists as pundits, it's that, if nothing else, that is the single most thing that I think is harming our credibility.
You want to add?
I have no thought.
The only thing I'll add just very briefly, we're going to be releasing research in the next couple of weeks where we examine people's understanding of labels and whether they even see them, and the news is not good. So I think that we have to be thinking more carefully about how we're actually telling people, because just putting opinion at the top of the page is really insufficient. People don't notice it, they don't remember it, and it doesn't affect their evaluation of the article.
Background is in investigative journalism. One of your main arguments was that understanding your community is very important. But do you see have you also met people who are not in your community, who maybe send you hate speech? Have you built debate with them? And is that needed when you are trying to build the trust?
So I respond to everything I get. I also have one gentleman who, I'm using the term loosely, who calls me once a month, which means I don't answer phone calls from 714 anymore. But I did have the first 5 or 6 conversations with him, and part of it's just how I'm wired, and I'm also, I'm not an on-air reporter. I'm not dealing with a lot of what our reporters, especially female reporters, deal with. There's another gentleman who emailed me from his work email, and he calls me the radio winch, which is a weird term. But like it's part of the territory, and I think that most of the time, the minute somebody feels seen, things change, and like we get a lot of comments or questions that when we respond, things change. We're a newsroom, we're a Public Insight Network newsroom, and when we have surveys, one of the things that we always ask is, can we quote you? And we give people the option of yes, no, and contact me first. Most people choose contact me first. the minute they realize that we have contacted them and we've written something with their name at the top, they go, oh, of course. It's just, when we're inviting that kind of vulnerability, folks want to know that we're in it with them. The other thing I say just generally, this isn't in response to your question, but when I'm meeting people and I'm inviting them to become a source for our newsroom, I always tell them that I won't ask any question I'm not willing to answer.
One thing I would add about just that the public record, when people are criticizing you publicly and getting something about you really wrong, you can wish that that weren't true, and you can blow them off and think they're not a member of my community and they're so ill-informed, like, why does this even matter? But if you don't respond, you're ceding the public record to them. You are letting them get the last word about who you are and what ethical framework you're based on and what you stand for. So I do err on the side of, have a comment policy and delete the people who shouldn't be there, breaking your rules, but do err on the side of responding so that you're taking control of that narrative back and not letting the record show something that's inaccurate about you.
I see a couple questions, and I'm also looking at our time, so here's what I'm going to suggest. I'm going to suggest we get a couple of questions in here, and then we'll let the panelists respond to those that are most relevant to them. So I see one back here.
Hi, so I was wondering what you guys would think about, this is a challenge I think a lot of news organizations deal with is like the shock value type of stories that some news organizations put out there to reach different goals, right? But then you lose that trust, and it's kind of like it turns people away with certain stories that people that are published because, again, to reach different goals. So is there anything that you guys ladies can advise us on? Because that happens all the time, every minute of the day with different media outlets. So that'd be great if y'all could advise us.
Love that. Let's grab 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we'll be really quick in our responses,
Okay.
and we'll try our best to respond to all of them.
Okay.
Great panel. Thank you for being here. Quick question. How do you view the role of public editors in this era? I mean, we've been seeing some publications do away with them entirely. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I'd just like to know where they're in, because the elections seem to have some relationship to trust. Election specific, learned about what went wrong, what could go better, what we should expect.
Great question about elections and relationship to trust. Yeah, go ahead. 2 more here, and then we'll answer.
So I really love the idea of inviting the community in, like physically in, to be part of the conversation. So how do you do that if your community is not in a specific place? I mean, I think it's great, Ashley, what you're talking about. And I love what you do, but I also think, well, yeah, everybody's in the LA area, so you can kind of do that. If you're geographically more distributed, if you're more topic-based or something like that, is there a way to accomplish that either virtually? Because doing it in person becomes a very difficult thing from a resource perspective.
And final one here, and then we will each answer not all of them, and we will try to answer all of these as quickly as we can.
Yeah, thank you. 2 questions. The one is when I write story about like hate speech, I get hundreds of comments from sometimes critical audience, and including internet trolls. And literally, I cannot respond to all of them. Yeah. So how can we deal with this situation? This is first question. Second question is really simple. How can we measure the trust? Any indicator?
Pardon?
How can we measure trust?
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Joy looks really ready. Go.
Oh, do I?
Go.
Born
We're
ready.
leaning in. Okay.
Specifically on election coverage, I'm working on a project called the Citizens Agenda for election coverage, where you base your coverage on what people actually tell you they want the candidates to be talking about. So I encourage you to look at that. Public editors are so important. If you don't, honestly, I wish they weren't needed. I wish everyone in the newsroom accepted that being publicly accountable was part of their job. But somebody needs to carry this mantle and train the rest of the newsroom to do it. And then if you want to talk more about specific strategies, Lynn and I are doing a workshop this afternoon at 2:30 where we'll talk a little bit more and show some quick examples of what our newsroom partners do, and then have like a live brainstorming where you tell us what problem you're trying to solve and we help. So we'd love to see you there.
I'm going to be pretty specific and answer the question about meeting people where they are and if you're covering like the entire country. So Zoom has really great features, and you can do breakout rooms, and you can have several hundred people talking at a time. Art of Hosting does different sessions that you can do, like webinars to learn how to have conversations online and have those sort of spaces. I think about like what Will Carlos has done and Reveal with the Hate Sleuths, and so like how can you bring people in and sort of forge this kind of community without necessarily having to physically be in the same space. And then, I think that, and this isn't necessarily that, but one of the things that we found with Unheard LA that we didn't anticipate was the kind of community that would grow from past participants. So we've had about 120 people that have participated at this point. And basically at their request, we started a Facebook group. And I'm no Hannah Wise. I'm not the master of Facebook groups. But we check in and we sort of tend this community, and that community goes out to become the activators for building our community in other ways. And so I think that figuring out how people want to stay in touch is really helpful, or even using something like an SMS service to have regular conversations and check-ins has been helpful for us.
Okay, so real quickly, public editors, we need them back. It's very important. Election specific, we're thinking about this for Canada right now, and we just really need to get out there with what are we doing, and from a standpoint of media news literacy, here's how you can tell the difference, public, between what we produce and all this information you're going to get flooded with. And that's something that every newsroom can do. And then I wanted to just briefly touch on also this question about hate speech. I would recommend talking to or looking at the work of Joan Donovan from Harvard University, because we can't always respond to, we shouldn't always respond to everything that is thrown at us, because that can in turn do more harm. So look at what Joan's doing. And then finally, the very first question about the shock value stories, that in part is why we started why I started the Trust Project, was we were kind of in this digital environment, that's what's rewarded. So now we are structurally trying to shift that with the Trust Project, with the trust indicators. And I think we are having some impact because the technology platforms are working with us. And they realize that what they need to do is be thinking about rewarding quality and surfacing quality, trustworthy news, as opposed to just either what's shocking and what's people are clicking on. So that's number one. Number two is just from an internal newsroom standpoint, how do you make the argument? Well, just ask people to think about, like, when you are writing a shocking headline, clickbait, yes, you're getting that attention, but what are you losing as a result? And what you're losing is this long-term relationship of trust that you're trying to build. And even one bad headline can really throw that out the window. And I know it's a tough conversation in newsrooms right now, but it's a really important one to have.
Very quickly, one, we did some research where headlines that had the shock value on hard news topics actually did not yield more clicks than headlines that did not use those kind of shock and awe sorts of techniques. Forgive that phrasing. But it doesn't work, so it's actually misdirected. So urge that. Two, measuring trust, lots of different ways to measure that. Would be happy to chat with you or anyone else who's interested in that. Three, we are working on establishing a network of people who are interested in media trust. Urge you to sign up on this Google Sheet. The reason we're doing it is when people have events related to media trust and they want to know, like, who do we invite? Who's interested in this? Urge you to sign up on this sheet. It's also a way for you, if you're interested in this, to populate a Twitter feed or something, a Twitter list, so that you know who to follow to get more on this. Urge you all to sign up. I hope that you all come away with some practical tips and some good thoughts on building trust in newsrooms, and thank you so much for being here today.
I have one last comment, which is we are hiring. So I just want to underline, we are hiring a community manager. So we've got put these little cards around. So please, if you know somebody would be great, maybe it's you, let me know. Sorry to interrupt all that wonderful applause.
Many thanks.
Thank you.